I want to thank everybody for joining us in today's webinar on cynicism and change. Today we have Bud Cadell. He is the founder of Nobel. Prior to that, he was actually partner at the strategic consultant of Undercurrent and SVP of digital strategy and innovation at Deutsch LA. So he knows a thing or two about the challenges that are incorporated in making change. And he is coming to you live today from San Francisco. We also have our chief behavioral scientist joining us. That's Dr. Kim Perkins, and she has her PhD in positive organizational psychology. Before joining Nobel, she was an executive coach and a former pro athlete, so knows a lot about performance and excellence, and she is joining us from Los Angeles. I will hand it over to the two of you.
Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, we're really excited to talk about this topic. Kim and I have been nerding out about cynicism and change for what, like 4 or 5 months now?
Absolutely.
Spoiler alert, we're actually like kicking around this topic in terms of a book. So we're gonna have a short survey at the end just to get a sense of like, did it resonate with you? Do you wanna learn more? What do you wish other people knew about this topic? So it'll be a very painless survey at the end, but we'd love it if you stuck around to take it with us. Otherwise, I'm sure this is a topic that lots of us have some familiarity with or some personal intimacy with. I know I do, and I know that Kim does as well. We both experienced it in our change work. Just to give you a quick sense of like, if you showed up here and you're like, who is Nobel? Who are these people? I just want to give you a quick background on us. I promise to make it quick. I founded Nobel in 2014. Now we have teams in LA, San Francisco, Vancouver, New York, and London. We like to call ourselves org designers, and that we think that we sit at the intersection of strategy and culture. We do everything from organizational design, and that really helps you think about the impact of your strategy, structures, and systems and how they work together. Obviously, we do lots and lots of change management work, whether that's a big punctuated change in terms of a new leader or a new acquisition, or it's just helping teams sense what's changing around them and make small constant steers in the market. We do a lot of leadership development work, especially around resilient leadership, because we live in such a world now that your energy and your presence and your self-awareness and self-management is so critical when you're leading among uncertainty. And we're just nerds about new ways of working. I mean, this is one of the things we obsess over because we're constantly searching for teams that are experimenting with new ways of collaboration, new ways of working with customers. And if you visit our site, academy.nobel.io, you'll find lots of resources there in terms of new ways of working from the teams that we've researched and talked to. I just to think about our perspective on culture, and I think it will be helpful in our conversations around change and cynicism. My background specifically, I was an innovation guy for a lot of big companies. I helped think about new products and services. And what I came to realize over, a decade spent helping people develop new products and services is actually that the competitive advantage wasn't in the ideas, because anyone can have the ideas. The competitive advantage is in the culture, a culture that can accept new ideas, can experiment, can scale new ideas, and can react to change. And so really our biggest belief is that culture is the last sustainable competitive advantage in a world when anything can be copied. We worked in almost every kind of industry you can think of for almost any kind of scale company. We're very metrics obsessed. You can see all of our fancy bullet points on the right, but just know that our goal when we come into an organization is really to think about the culture as being the goose that laid the golden egg. In my previous career, the new product, the new service, that was the golden egg, but really think about the thing that generates those ideas. That's sort of where we obsess over these days. And lastly, if you ever want to work with us, there's 3 ways to work with us. There's training programs. So thinking about, change management, agile change management, the topic we're going to cover today, we're more than happy to come in and do trainings around that. We do a lot of offsite designs, especially for leadership and executives, around planning for change and responding to it. And then lastly, for clients who are ready to make a big leap in terms of their culture, we'll do embedded change, where we're on site 2 to 3 days a week from a month, 3 months, 6 months, helping make big, meaningful, and lasting change in the organization. But that's it. That's it about us. Let's get started about change and cynicism. Hey, Kim, does this sound familiar based on any of our work?
I think I've heard this once or twice before, Bud.
A leader recognizes that we need to make change, and then they're met with immediate change resistance in the form of cynicism.
This is
yeah. Go ahead.
This is something, this little dialogue, something along these lines is something that as I go out and give talks about change around the country, I hear this as being one of the biggest complaints that people have. And this is partly what has inspired this work, is that these kind of reactions like you see in Blue are very much what's on people's minds when they go out to try to sell change around their organization.
Yeah. And, certainly because we work with leadership often, in the beginning, this is the perspective on cynicism, but I hope after our conversation today too, we'll be able to share a lot of perspective from the people who are feeling that cynicism as well. So this isn't just about you're a leader and you have to deal with cynicism. This is also about what it means to feel cynicism and what it means to experience change through that lens.
Definitely. So at this point, people usually, we need to have kind of a definition of cynicism so we know what we're talking about going forward. And people bring a lot of different things into it. But our definition is that it's a disbelief in the possibility of change and a distrust of the people in power. So there's really two things here that separate cynicism from skepticism. So skepticism is like, yes, but I don't think it'll work. And cynicism is, no, it'll never work. And actually, if you think about the philosophical heritage that behind cynicism, it almost comes with a resistance to and making fun of whatever the status quo is. So it's really keeping yourself kind of apart from that and not getting involved in what you see the big picture, the main part of the society doing. So it's really not just going along with change unenthusiastically, but being actively certain that a change can never happen because this is a closed system that has certain rules.
Yeah, it's so important that we all align around this, because when we have these conversations around cynicism, people can easily start to think about other boxes. To Kim's point around skeptics, also we get them, we've had clients who confuse them a lot with dissenters, people who just think that maybe the change that's being proposed isn't the right change. When, our perspective on dissent is absolutely necessary in any sort of change or any sort of new endeavor you do. It's about giving that dissent a voice and venue, collecting those fears and then moving on. But cynicism is more, to me, it stays with you through the program. It's not just like, hey, I'm not sure about that idea. It's real, to Kim's point, detachment from the possibility of it and detachment from the process itself.
Definitely.
So today, we're going to cover cynicism and change. Our hope for you coming out of this is really to be able to think about how you can convert cynics into change champions. So that means understanding cynicism. That means engaging cynics and even engaging your own cynicism through a change process so that you can create advocates for the change that you're trying to make.
So there's some aspects of cynicism that really go deep. People often think of cynicism as like a personal attribute. Well, oh, that guy's so cynical. But we find that it actually intersects on 4 different levels here. And so on the personal level, it's research has shown pretty consistently in the 40% of workers feeling cynical about change in their organization, at least a little bit. So there have been study after study that shows it somewhere between 44 and 50% of workers. So it's something that's not just a few people off isolated. It's something that people who are in the mainstream feel a lot, and therefore something to reckon with. And we often think of it as an interpersonal thing that has it's a little bit communicable, so that when it can have real social impact and real consequences. When people are cynical, they're much more likely to burn out. They have lower engagement, and performance often suffers when there's a lot of cynicism going around. And often it does come in waves because it's a valid, rational response to what's going on, rather than a personal attribute that people just bring into every situation. So, organizationally, if change is a constant, organizations have to deal with this over and over and over. And what they do about change work today is going to affect how cynical people become and how change resistant they will be tomorrow. And so it ends up being kind of either a virtuous or a vicious cycle for how going into the future, how much cynicism you have and how much you allow it to flourish. And finally, societally, I think this is something that a lot of us are feeling these days, that there's just a massive distrust of institutions, distrust of power, multiple narratives going on, and but that in itself promotes a lot of chaos. And also people are just checking out by trolling and being part of adding to that chaos and complexity with intentional misinformation on both the organizational and the societal level. And this is some of the things that we see from some of the same factors in our society that promote cynicism in organizations as well.
Yeah. And I would say like I said, we've been nerding out on this for quite a while, but the genesis of us even wanting to explore this topic is because every time we go into an organization and, there is a groundswell of support around change, we'll still find cynics, and they'll always say to us, well, we tried this before and it didn't work, or it wasn't earnest, or it wasn't fair. And so to Kim's point, this idea of a vicious cycle of, for every failed change attempt, you're just generating more and more cynics inside the organization until the point where change might not be possible, actually. So we're going to cover today, we've got a lot of content. We promise to move quickly, but we will make time for Q&A. We're going to talk about some common misconceptions. We're going to talk about how to engage and convert cynics when possible and how to do that thoughtfully. And then we're going to quickly talk about dealing with your own cynicism, because all of us, to Kim's point about 48 to 54%, I think that's probably higher just in life, the moments that we felt cynicism when it comes to change in institutions. We'll talk about that a bit and then open up for discussion. So first, let's talk about some misconceptions. Kim, tell us about how cynics are misunderstood.
Well, the first thing is that cynicism isn't personal. I was hinting earlier that it's not just a personality trait, and it's not just something that we trivialize. A lot of times change consultants will talk about resistance to change as if it is an irrational thing that people who just are stick in the muds or Luddites just don't want to change, and that's something wrong with them. But actually, cynicism is a very rational response, and it's a rational response to a situation that has been that you found frustrating, where you couldn't carry out the moral thing that you felt needed to happen, whether that was doing work to a certain standard or rewarding people appropriately. It's actually so cynicism is actually a very rational response based on people's experiences rather than their ideas. So when we're thinking about it here, as it's a rational response to a systemic injustice. So it's not when people are often worried when I go out and speak, people are asking me how to deal with the cynics in their organizations, and they are worried that the people are going to take it that the other people's cynicism is a reflection on them as a person. And it is absolutely not. It has nothing to do with you, the bearer of change, as a person. It's not personal. It's not about you as a leader, and it's not about even about the thing that you are trying to change necessarily. It's more about their own experiences and how they're interpreting the mental model that they have of the world that makes it okay for them to keep living in this imperfect world.
I think this point to me, when we started doing this research, Kim, this point that you made to me was so profound. And that, like, I will admit, in earlier parts of my career, I was the consultant who was like, why won't these people get on board? They like it the way it is. And now understanding that it's actually a response to the system and a sense of perceived injustice is huge for me. And to understand that, and to understand that it's about the system itself and making change to the system. It's not about attacking the response to it. And it just became really real to me when my sister's a teacher in Texas, and her school is like constantly being underfunded, and they are asking teachers in her school to do more and more with less and less. And it's creating a lot of cynicism in terms of, they're told a lot of promises that are never kept. They're asked to do things that, are changes to them that, they don't quite understand. And then in response, the school board is holding literal pep rallies for teachers to try to create a sense of belonging. And what it's doing is it's actually created this like shadow council of cynics in the school, which my sister is a part of people who are just like, has just only fueled their disbelief in change, and also really fueled that distrust in leadership, because clearly they're not listening to them. Clearly they're not trying to make change. And that's, that was such a eye-opening experience to listen to.
It's a great example. When I was doing my dissertation research on passion, there were a lot of studies about passion in teaching in particular that would then turn to cynicism if it was not able to find if people weren't able to do the work the way that they wanted to do it, and that the way that it ought to be done. So it's kind of, cynicism is kind of a occupational hazard of doing something that's really important to you.
Yeah. And the last point here I think is important too, because if you're ready to create change, you see this a lot in, say, diversity and inclusion programs where a leadership team announces a big change initiative around it, but a high profile figure in the company either doesn't support it, or, even their narrative of how they got in that position goes against it. And if that's not addressed in some way, it really can sustain that cynicism in the organization around sort of the belief in that change and the effectiveness of it.
Yes, and a lot of change work that we have seen, if there are toxic leaders in the company who, if people are allowed to flourish by being good at the work but bad at taking care of people, or by stepping on everybody else to do it, those leaders have to go before anybody will believe that this change work is something that they can take part in.
Yeah. All right. What about cynics or irrational people?
Cynics are extremely rational. People think that, again, as we were talking about, thinking about change cynicism as an irrational emotional response to being asked to change. It's actually more that people are relying on a very rational interpretation of their circumstances. People have spent a lot of time thinking about the system and what it is responding to. And so cynics, the difference here is that cynics have evidence, right? Cynics are very interested in putting together a rational understanding of what's going on based on evidence, whereas people who are maybe just grumpy or pessimistic tend to be a little bit more irrational about it. So failed attempts at change tend to add to the evidence, and that's why they can be why it's often harder to make change in organizations where there have been many, many, many attempts to make change previously with only limited success or little success.
No, this is totally you. I love your expression, don't expect your argument to eclipse their experience. I think that says everything about, our immediate response of like, no, I want to argue with these people and open it up. But again, they're pulling from a well of well-earned experience.
Yes. And we always treat, psychologically, our experience always outweighs any argument that anybody can give us.
Yeah. I think this point is also important in that you need to give yourself some space and some care when you feel cynical. I think, no matter where you are on a political spectrum, I think, especially in the world we live in today, everyone is cynical about some kind of institution. And I think it takes an emotional toll on people, especially when you start to beat yourself up around it. Like, why do I feel this way? And it's important to create that care and compassion for yourself if you are feeling cynical.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's part of when we're thinking about, self-care for people who are not necessarily those who are most rewarded in the systems that we're in. That's really the point of self-care, is to not take out things that are systemic on yourself and your personality.
Yeah. All right.
And so finally, the idea is that we think that cynics are powerless. We think that they're the grumpy, weird person in the corner, but that is so not true. We find that actually people who have cynical attitudes tend to be very well placed in the company a lot of the time. They figured out how to work the system that they're in, so they've managed to get the rewards from it. And often cynics have bonded with a lot of people. So it's really easy to bond in a workplace environment over all the things that are going wrong. And I think we all have work friends where we're going, how is it going today? Oh, the usual, it's terrible. And we can, those negative circumstances bring us together, at least the appearance of it's us against the world can really make people feel bonded. And then, so in that way, it can be also sort of systemic within a company where this is the normal way that people bond, as opposed to bonding over more positive things or things that are actually happening. But so that often means that there's a lot of bonding going around based on cynicism or based on thinking that things aren't going so well.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, cynics are not the enemies of change. So a lot of times people think cynics are going to be automatic saboteurs, or people who are trying to keep things from changing because they are somehow invested in the status quo. And invested in the status quo they might be, but really cynics are people who are disillusioned idealists. Cynics are disillusioned idealists. And so if there is a better way to do things, they would actually rather do it that way than do it in the status quo, because that would be irrational. So cynics, we find, can be converted to change champions. One of that you have to do it in a way that makes it possible for the cynic to change their interpretation of their experiences. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. Even just saying cynics are heartbroken idealists has opened the door with cynics in our change programs. I think it connects to them on a level that they haven't been connected to before, in terms of like, we know that you want the organization to work in a more effective way, to be in a more fair and equitable way. But you've been beaten down by that. Mm-hmm. And, we don't expect you to fix everything. That's why we're here, but be open to change when you see it happening.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Kim, so tell us about how we actually we're in a change program. We're leading it, or we're a consultant supporting it. How do we engage with cynics when we find them?
So the most important thing is to be strategic. So we always say, it's very tempting for everybody to start immediately engaging with the naysayers and to out-argue them and give them a reason to get on board. And this is a lot of wasted breath most of the time. So in a nutshell, what we want is for you, the change maker, to know who's going to support you right off the bat, who's going to go to the mat for you. These are your change champions, and give them the most resources first. And then after that, they will go out and convert the fence sitters, which is most of the organization. Like 70% of the organization are the people who are just waiting to see which way the wind blows in order to get on board with your change or not. And if it looks like we're going to do this, they'll just do this, and it's not about a rational argument. However, there are going to be some cynics that might be in high places that you need to get on board. And so rather than convert all the cynics, we'd like you to be strategic and think about which are the cynics that need converting, because they could actually put the kibosh on your change by, for example, telling the people in their department not to cooperate, or giving people an idea that they don't have to do this. So those are the people who you might want to consider actually converting. And when you're also thinking about who to convert, it's going to be important to distinguish the two groups we're going to talk about next. And that is cynics from, I'll just call them general grumps. And that means, in this case, pessimists, people who have, by virtue of their personality, aren't going to take part in this. And so the main thing here is that convertible cynics, people you can convert, will rely on evidence, and they also wish for a better way of doing things. They're not straight up pessimists who believe that nothing can ever work. They're defensive pessimists who believe that it could work, but this is going to take a lot of work and energy to get there. And I don't know if that's really ever going to happen. So the grumpy people, on the other hand, are kind of immune to evidence. And so if people are in the grumpy side, maybe they're not the strategic cynic that you need to convert. Maybe you have a different way of working with a well-placed grump. But a well-placed cynic is somebody who can do the campaign that we're going to talk about next on.
Yeah, I just love, if you take anything away from this, I love, Kim, your definition of grumps are immune to evidence. Cynics are amenable to evidence.
So the first thing we always want to do is start to make a beautiful, rational argument that a cynic cannot possibly poke holes in, and that is the wrong thing, because neither logic nor enthusiasm will convert a cynic. So instead, I've got 3 different propositions I want to go through with you, Bud.
Yeah.
Right. So would you say this to a cynic, or would you not say this to a cynic? That first one.
I personally guarantee to you that No, I don't think I'd want to say that to a cynic because I don't want to set myself up to fail.
Yes, you don't want to set yourself up to fail, but also the cynic doesn't care what you personally guarantee because you're just a pawn of the system anyway. So they don't have it's not about you, but they don't have any faith in any one person's ability to get past this because it's a systemic thing, the way they see it. Okay, what about the second one?
Together we can make this one of the best workplaces ever. Again, it feels to me, I was raised on, you under promise and over deliver. So this one, no, would be a no for me.
This is meant to be an inspirational phrase, like, we're going to go to the moon in 10 years. And although that works on a lot of people, that does not work on cynics at all, because again, they are not necessarily cheered by the idea of working on a big vision together the way many people are. How about that third one?
This time it's different because of, this one feels tempting for sure. Because I want to help them understand how their past evidence may not be as applicable to this time. So I might venture into this territory, but did I get it right or wrong?
You got it right.
Sweet.
You got it right. So here again, don't want to do it with a cheerleading tone, but if you can mention to them as you're talking with them, the reasons it's different this time. So this time, we're doing it, we've gotten some outside help, and we are in a different economic era, and there's a different economic pressures on our marketplace that make these changes really necessary, and the CEO supports it. You may not just convince them in one conversation, but these are the kind of things that can help convince a cynic that the system is actually changing, not just that you're going to try to change the system. So what you do is, to convert a cynic, is that you really, what you do in a nutshell is you ask them what they might want out of this, and then you give it to them. So you notice my key word in there is might, which means that if you tell them what they do want out of this, they will tell you 15 times from Sunday, no, it'll never happen. Well, I mean, we would, there's nothing to want out of this because it's never going to happen. But if you but do take what I call the homeopathic approach, which is that you say, you acknowledge that, okay, it'll probably never happen. But if it did, what would you want out of this? Then you can sometimes get them to say something small that they want. And often it is really small. It's not usually going all the way into a global change. It's just some small thing that they think would be much better, that they absolutely can't stand that we're doing it this way right now, this other way that's so wrong. So if you managed, here's some things on the next slide that I have seen convert cynics. You see, they're very small wins. So first one, 5 p.m. meeting rule. This was like, can we please stop having emergency meetings at 5 p.m.? We should know it's an emergency earlier in the day. So we went in and tried to made an agreement to, for 1 month, try not doing that. It worked. And then the cynic was on board because they could see that the system could change. So all of these things are just very small things meant to that were the tipping point for getting some high profile cynics on board. In one company we're in, people thought that there was no way that leaders could ever give credit to anybody but themselves about the work that they were doing. So when we got the leaders to do that, they said, okay, guess system can change. Maybe I'll give this a shot. And even something as small as a cold soda. I was out gathering data during my graduate career at a bike race. We had a woman who's going around telling everybody to please stop taking my survey because she needed to get her husband out of here because she was so overheated that she couldn't stand to be here any longer. I gave her a cold soda and she immediately changed her tune. She said, hey, everybody come here and take this woman's survey. And so the point is, it's not really about the magnitude of the thing. It's about giving people something that they actually want. You can convert a cynical person into a change champion by demonstrating that the system can change and there is something that they want out of this.
Yeah, I definitely think this goes back to the fact that they're idealists at heart in terms of they're not expecting, they're just looking for something, right? They're just looking for some proof. I think they won't admit it publicly, but that, one small piece of evidence that change is possible can be really powerful to them, even if it's tiny. And I know if you're listening to this, you might think, oh, these are so small, but really small wins stack up. And it's so important to think about, what they might want to be able to bring them along through the process. Yeah.
Yes. You have to show them that change is possible rather than tell them that change is possible.
Yeah. All right. So the last section, what about your cynicism? How, you're feeling cynical about change. How do you deal with it, especially when you're a leader?
This is such an important concept. So the first thing you have to think about is, do you have to work with it at all? So if you've been tasked with leading a change, you probably do. Or if it's something that you just can't stand, just you're fed up and you just can't stand to see the world going this way, because it is always a justice issue, that this might be a time when you need to examine and engage with your own cynicism. So cynics can't lead change. So if you're really trying to make a change, you can't do it from a cynical place. It just doesn't work that way. There has to be some vision, some optimism, some hope moving forward to mobilize other people, and also to mobilize your own resources, so that you don't just keep having confirmation bias and seeing more evidence that the status quo is the only thing that can happen. So as we were talking about earlier, you need to know that you're here because of your beliefs and your experiences, and you can't change what has already happened, but you can change going forward. And so it's so important to start locally and not like try to be a non-cynical person, but instead just look for places where it's worth it to you to engage your cynicism on a very small local level. And so once you get there, then the main thing is to excuse me, think about what you can do. Think about what you can shift. And it might feel like, again, might feel like a little nothing, like those things we said converted cynics. But what we're doing is looking for a place where maybe there is something that you could see within your sphere of influence that you could affect on this. A lot of times when we work with teams, everybody in the beginning is very much focused on, well, these guys didn't do this, and these guys didn't do this, and those guys will never do this. And then if we work with them long enough, usually there's this moment where they go, oh, actually, some of this is inside our control. There is something we can do about this. It's not just them. It's not just out of our control. And the more you focus on the things that are within your control, the more your ability to control things expands outwards. So, those are some of the things that it's important when we're engaging our own cynicism to remember.
Yeah, and especially if you're a leader, that fourth point is important and tough, but be careful spreading cynicism by bonding over what's broken. Again, complaining about what's happening or what's wrong is a really fast way to bond with others in an organization, but it has long-term consequences.
It does. It puts you in a negative spiral where, therefore, it feels like all we can do to be sure that we'll get a positive reaction from each other is to complain. And that really gets in the way.
All right. So that's, our coverage of cynics and change. We talked a bit about, some misconceptions about cynicism and change. We talked about how to engage and convert cynics, and we talked about your own cynicism. I know that some questions came in, and I want to have plenty of time to talk about it. Just before we'll go back to that in a second, I just want to pause here and we can take some questions.
Yeah, so as I said, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them into the group chat and we will get to them. So first question that we had from Manuela, I like this question. Why would a cynic stay, right? Whether there's a lot of changes going on or maybe things are staying the same and they don't think things can change, why would they bother sticking around?
It's a great question. And we often ask ourselves that. And in fact, I would say in some of our engagement, when we hear people complaining a lot, that's one of the things that I often ask people is why, okay, so if it's so bad, why are you still here? And that's part of a way of refocusing people on what they're actually getting out of it. So a lot of times at work, people are here because, well, it's a good job and I've learned how to work the system. So even though I think it's all terrible, I'm going to stay here. And then it has gone from being something more purpose-driven, more mission-driven for them to something very, very transactional. And maybe that's a golden handcuffs kind of situation. But again, we're saying with cynics, there always is sort of a background, at least, hope that things might be able to get better or might be able to be different. And I think that drives people more than they are often willing to admit.
Good question. Next one.
All right, the next one is from Tim. So At one point in the presentation, you said, don't argue with the cynic. You're not going to be able to convince them based on their own experience. But then in the do's and don'ts, you mentioned, well, you can explain why this time is different, right? So what is the difference? Like, why is it okay to argue that, no, this time is different, as opposed to just trying to convince them overall? Like, no, you should get on board.
That's a great question. You shouldn't try to convince them by saying this time is different. You should say, okay, yeah, you take the tension off by saying, yeah, you're probably right. It's going to be tough to change this system, but this time is different because of these things. And then you don't dwell on it and say, are you on board yet? You say, okay, I'm with you. It's going to be tough, but here we go.
Great. Yeah. So next one is from Alistair. Tim, I know you have another one. I want to get everybody in and then we'll go back. So Alistair had one, which I think I'm going to try and summarize as first world problems, right? So let's say positive change is happening, right? So any injustices and transgressions are getting less frequent and less severe. But something like prevalence-induced concept change means that the definition of injustice or transgression expands and the definition of positive change contracts. So cynics keep finding more and more evidence for their perspective, right? So you've solved the big problems. How do you deal with the quote unquote like first world problems? Are they still problems?
Well, I don't think you're ever going to completely eradicate cynicism. Oh, and I don't think you're ever going to eradicate a certain amount of bonding over the negative, because those are part of the human condition. So, we all now have flush toilets, and that is a fantastic thing, but we still find fault with, our lives at a certain point, right? Even though, no matter how great things get, and I think like a lot of us here in the first world are living very much the apex of comfort in society that humans ever gotten to live. And there's still a lot of things wrong. And so we're going to have that, Yeah. So I think that it's not so much about trying to eradicate it, because then you move into sort of all of the manipulative and thought control. And then you really are going to be in kind of a cycle where people push back. So you don't want to try to eradicate it, but you want to kind of get it down to a dull roar.
The thing that makes this topic really juicy for me, even beyond our immediate work, is this idea of, I keep my eye constantly on employee-led movements inside companies. So when Google employees strike for, equity or fairness or, issues of social justice, I find that so fascinating, because I wonder what the relationship between our cynicism in our government institutions is doing to our cynicism in our organizations and corporations. And I think there's something there, and that's something that I think we want to explore in the future too, around like we realizing our cynicism outside the organization. We realize how much power the organization we're working in has, and then we start to make change and advocate for change there, which is, I think a really fascinating phenomenon to pay attention to.
I agree. It's not, they're not separate. They're not as separate as you might think.
Yeah.
So Bill had a question about cynics and idealism, right? We said that cynics are just disappointed idealists. So Bill wants to know, in assessing the cynics' idealism, have you used appreciative inquiry process? And if so, what do you think of that method? Oh, Kim's excited.
Appreciative inquiry, sure, that's a bedrock of positive psychology, and and we use this all the time. Now, the full appreciative inquiry method, of course, is the entire company focusing for days on having these difficult conversations and envisioning the future of the company. And so we don't really usually drag it out that long. We more put aspects of that into everything that we do, but don't do it as really one big focus. So I'm starting to just geek out on this. So maybe you should remind me.
You've unleashed her.
You have, because we're talking about stuff I love. Anyway, we do use it. We use a lot of appreciative inquiry approaches, and it's important because you have to, given humans' negativity bias, you have to actively search out and put some focus on the positive in order to get just a clear and balanced picture of what's going on. And cynics definitely have that tendency, because there is that bonding thing of wanting to talk about what's not working and to be sarcastic about it and to be ridiculously clever about it and appreciate my cleverness about just stating about the problems, and so you do have to pair that back with a lot of appreciative inquiry in order to get a clear and accurate picture.
Great. All right. And Kim, you're actually getting encouragement from the peanut gallery about geeking out, so you're fine. Let's see, we've got one from Alex, which is, how do you handle cynics using the fear of not conforming to senior stakeholders, pushing off their concerns to other areas of power?
Okay, so the question is how cynics are not conforming to.
Just using social pressure. Is that the idea?
I'm not sure I quite get it. I don't think I quite get it. But do you know what we're talking about?
I mean, I'm sure this will correct us, but it sounds like, how do you use social or peer pressure in conforming with cynics in an organization?
It's a great question.
Yeah. I want to geek out.
You go for it.
Well, I think it just, to me, having worked with lots of cynics and change programs, I think there's a spectrum on which cynics have developed an identity around their cynicism, and actually their nonconformity is a strength and a virtue at that stage. And by trying to create conformity, like my sister's school administrators would try to do, by trying to bring her into the organization, literally create a venue where if she's not positive and cheering, she's clearly on the outside of the village, did nothing but turn her off. And I actually think it creates more trolling and more chaos in the system. It really forces people into that position.
Yeah, we use a lot of social pressure in our methods, but they're not overt social pressure. I mean, I won't speak for my colleagues, but I was definitely not a cheerleader in high school. I was the kid smoking cigarettes out under the bleachers. And so I'm very sensitive to those things that create in-groups and out-groups, and that those out-groups that really enjoy and are defined by being part of an out-group. And and all these attempts to get people juiced up about it and excited about the company and the vision in the future really can definitely create those groups and make them very strong and empowered and make them very resistant. And so I'm not a fan of a lot of cheerleading as social pressure to conform, because it just doesn't work for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we have time for 2 more questions. We'll do Alexis and then Tim. So I think this question from Alexis is actually a great segue from that last question, which is, how do you nip cynicism in the bud, right? How do you prevent that social contagion of, let's say we've got an idealistic leader who's initially enthusiastic, but they're becoming disillusioned, they're becoming negative around their team. So how do you prevent people from being infected by cynicism if you're not going to be a cheerleader and hold pep rallies?
Well, you can't prevent them from being that. The best way, honestly, and this is maybe an unsatisfying answer, is to do the right thing. Give people enough autonomy that they can live out their values without feeling like there's got to be this corporate mind control, and do the right thing and listen to people and have a certain amount of transparency and openness where you can hear people's ideas, take them into account, and circle back and say, if we're not going to do it, say we're not going to do it and this is why. But those open dialogues and treating people like humans rather than resources to be corralled is really what's going to keep people inspired and not cynical.
Yeah. And like I said before, some elements of cynicism come across as dissent. And, I think, again, create a venue. We do things like pre-mortems where we say, okay, we're about to embark on this change. Tell us all the ways we can fail. Let's get it all out on the table and create a venue for it, and then create, a social pact moving forward of, okay, we've collected these, we're going to take action based on them. You see that it's changed our roadmap. You see that we're paying attention to these things. Dissent and fear and even cynicism can't persist all the time, though. And again, to Kim's point, you can't control that really, but I think oftentimes we don't even allow for the space to talk about what could go wrong in these change programs. And by giving people a venue, you can try to sort of release some pressure off that valve and move forward.
All right, the very last question is from Tim. I really like this. If you're unable to deliver wins when saying what can I do for you, right, to try and get this cynic on your side, if you're unable to deliver on those promises, do you run the risk of changing somebody from just a cynic to a grump, right? How do you prevent that from happening, or can you pull people who are grumps back over into the light side?
Great question. So if you can't deliver on a promise for a cynic, then basically the status quo remains. They are like, see, I told you. But the great news about that is it's kind of no harm, no foul in a way, because you didn't convert them, which might have consequences in the short run, but in the long run, you didn't make it you didn't necessarily make it particularly worse. And I want to clarify, when you're asking the cynic what they want, you don't want to ask them in terms of what do you want for yourself. Cynicism is an organizational justice issue. So instead we want to ask more like, what is it that we want about the way the work's getting done, about the way people are getting rewarded? What is it about the system that we want, rather than what do you want? Because a cynical person might often decide that that's a great time to ask for something impossible, or something that would be, not serving the system to have, just to see if they can get it sometimes, right? So you don't want that. But I think, let's put it this way: every cynic I've run across, there has been something that they want for the work, for a higher moral value, and delivering them that is the thing to deliver.
I also think it's important to, and this is a little bit of a bias in our change process, is that I don't think you should really engage cynics until you know that you can start to, you can have efficacy and change. So oftentimes, like, we'll experiment at the fringes to understand what's really possible before we go out and before we sort of make a huge announcement. And that's not always possible. I mean, clearly, oftentimes there are big changes that you have to react to, but if it isn't something as stark as like a leader leaves and a new leader emerges, or a merger and acquisition, something where there is a very clear before and after, I think you can experiment. I call it like the cult of curious people who just want to experiment, say, for new ways of working. Start there, see what's possible within the organization, see where the limits are and the barriers are, and then start to engage people who might be cynical once you know what you can and cannot deliver.
Yes, I think that's really important, what Bud said too. Know what you can and can't deliver. Don't promise the moon. If they ask for the moon, say, I definitely can't do that. If you can get it down to, a moon.
It's a moon dust. Yeah.
Dust. And also the other important thing is this is no substitute for not having people at higher levels on board. You're still going to need to have the ear of people at higher levels in any change situation. And I found that is one thing that takes change really fast, is if you don't have people on board with at least trying stuff and iterating. And a lot of our work, we posit everything as a trial, as an iteration, as a test, so that way, if it doesn't end up working out, it doesn't make people more entrenched.
All right. Well, thank you, Bud and Kim, for taking those questions. I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the book, and then I'll close everybody out.
Yeah, just everyone, thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to anyone who posted a question. If you have other questions, please come ask, because actually you're helping us shape, how we're talking about this. Kim and I and everyone at Nobel thinks that this is such a critical topic. I think we're encountering cynicism everywhere we go, and a lot of us are feeling it in everyday life. And I think this could be a really powerful thing to help explore with people. And if you have feedback for us, we'd love to hear what resonated. There's I promise it's a very short survey at tinyurl.com/cynicismandchange, all spaced together. If you could just take 3 or 4 minutes after this, we're also going to capture all the questions that were asked, because I think those are gold for us. So thank you so much for that. Please try to take a few minutes to take the survey at the end of this, because it'll give us a ton of intelligence about, where we need to keep exploring, how we can flesh this out, how we can be helpful.
All right. So once again, want to thank everybody for attending. We will be sending out these slides. So if you're furiously taking notes, don't worry about it. We've got it all. We are recording this, so we'll be sharing the video. And of course, we'll be sending out a link to the survey so that you have a chance to take that. If you have any further questions, you can reach out to us at HEART, that's HEART, at nobl.io. I know it's a lot of spelling, but it's HEART at nobel.io. You can always find us at our website, which is nobel.io. And if you want to hear more about what we do and get a behind the scenes look, we also have a podcast which looks at fictional organizations and how leadership and change is manifested there. We just released an episode on Succession, season 1. So if you're a fan of the HBO show, go ahead and give it a listen. It's called Work of Fiction. Otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Bye-bye.